On your left.
Racist country.
All this legislation does is, in a very backhanded way, try to prevent teachers from using materials from the 1619 project.
The project, referenced by Hamilton County teacher Aaron Fowles, is a controversial initiative by the New York Times, which reframes the start of American history with the first arrival of African slaves. The initiative's introduction says it places the consequences of slavery and the contributions of Black Americans at the very center of our national narrative.
Now, teachers should not push their beliefs on students, but legislators should not push their beliefs on teachers. The legislation as it's written does not prevent a discussion from occurring. It does not prevent a student from raising their voice.
Critical race theory does not present the U.S. as evil. 1619 Project creator denies GOP view. The creator of the 1619 Project has hit back at GOP criticism of the New York Times initiative, which examines the consequences of slavery and racism on American history. The comments by Nicole Hannah-Jones comes as a debate rages about whether American students should be taught critical race theory, which examines how race and racism intersect with politics, culture, and the law. The Education Department published a proposal on April 19th for federal grant guidelines that would encourage more culturally responsive teaching and learning at K-12 schools, Fox News reported. The 1619 Project, released in 2019 to coincide with the 40th anniversary of the first arrival of enslaved Africans in colonial Virginia, was given as a positive example in the Education Department proposal. Also cited was the book How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. However, in a letter to Education Secretary Miguel Cardona, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, and other GOP lawmakers criticized the Biden administration's praise for the 1619 Project's work. In the missive obtained by CNN, the lawmakers outlined their broad objections to Biden administration's proposals for education programs addressing systemic racism. This is a time to strengthen the teachings of civics and American history in our schools, the letter said, adding that instead, your proposed priorities double down on divisive, radical, and historically dubious buzzwords and propaganda, which is bullshit. Describing the 1619 Project as a campaign that has become infamous for putting ill-formed advocacy ahead of historical accuracy, it said that Americans never decided our children should be taught that our country is inherently evil, giving lawmakers an interpretation of how the 1619 Project and CRT frames U.S. history. But Hannah-Jones denied that her project ever presented the U.S. as evil, and said that lawmakers like Mitch McConnell are trying to prohibit the teachings of ideas they don't like. There is no single line or argument in the 1619 Project that claims that this country is an evil country, and it's frankly a ridiculous assertion, she told CNN. I actually argue that Black people are the greatest democratizing force in this country, she added. This isn't a project about teaching children that our country is evil, but it is a project trying to teach children the truth about what our country was based upon. McConnell's letter outlines broad concerns that schools should focus on teaching history and civics without getting involved in culture wars. It said that Education Department is trying to reorient the bipartisan American history and civics programs away from their intended purposes toward politicized and divisive agenda. But Hannah-Jones said that slavery was foundational to the United States, after which there was 100 years of legalized discrimination against Black Americans called Jim Crow. Those are simply the facts of our history, she told CNN. What Mitch McConnell and others like him want is for our children to get a propagandistic, nationalistic understanding of history that is not about facts, but is how they want to pretend that our country is. See, that is the real thing behind it. The white folks really don't want slavery or the history of slavery or that kind of ugly history of what white folks did in this country to be outed. They don't want this stuff to be outed. They want to uphold the founders of our country and other kind of folks like Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was not a nice guy. He wasn't. Was he evil? No. I wouldn't say he was evil. He was pragmatic, and he was a businessman, and the stuff he did was not nice. The real history of any country's history is not nice. How should it be taught? How should it be framed? People talk about propaganda and brainwashing children. The Prussian school system brainwashes children. It does. It brainwashes children. But eventually this stuff is going to come out, which you see this all over the world. At some point, you're going to have to admit this stuff. At some point, there's too much information that goes around. Too many books have been printed. Too much information about the real truth about what this country is, what this nation is, what this whole Western experiment was. A lot of that stuff was not nice. And they're using this buzzword, critical race theory. Why? Because it's got race in it. They didn't have race in it. It was just critical theory. They wouldn't even use it. But critical race theory, which has never been taught in K through 12 and is rarely taught outside of law classes, even Ben Shapiro says the same thing. Not taught outside law classes. But as the previous video said, that really what the angst against critical race theory, or the buzzword critical race theory, is not about eliminating something that doesn't exist in K through 12. It's about stopping the 1619 project and the lessons and the ideas coming from the 1619 project from being spread, because they don't want, white folks don't want the evils of genocide against the Native Americans and the enslavement of black people to make money to be exposed. They want to whitewash that. Hell, even black folks want to whitewash that. Black folks don't want to remember this stuff. Most of them don't. They want to get absorbed by white people so they can be Americans and they don't have to be black anymore. Black folks did not invent race. Black folks, race was imposed upon us. It still is. Now, all the detractors in Art's panel that came over talking about critical race theory came over to argue the bullshit. You could have took 30 minutes and found this out. 30 minutes. This stuff has nothing to do with critical race theory and what Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw came up with. That's how come they're shocked when it actually came back up. It's actually bolt and stop the truth from coming out about 1619, about reframing slavery and actually putting black folks as slaves in their proper history. I just read a book written by a Southerner that is a Confederate historian. 80% of America's wealth came from what? Slavery. Came from the South, which is why they fought a Civil War, because Lincoln wanted to collect his money. And Jim Crow, okay, why they put black folks back on the South, back on the land after they were emancipated, because they still needed to make money. It's called capitalism. Slavery was capitalism. Slavery was the first capitalism. Ask Pizarro about the Aztecs and them forcing Aztec to mine silver for them. It's how Spain became rich. This is how come Europe became rich. Europe was poor before Pizarro went over there, actually went over to Latin America and started stealing their silver. I think it's Pizarro. I can't remember that. I do believe it was Pizarro. Pizarro, and there was somebody else. I can't remember his name. But the conquistadors went over there and took silver. That's how they became rich. And that's how come all the other Europeans wanted to come west, because they wanted to become rich. And they did. But nobody wants to admit that because they don't want to be embarrassed. So they rather make up a boogeyman, a straw man called critical race theory that is not taught, because they want to block the 1619 project. That's all. They could have said that from the beginning, but they can't block the 1619 project on its own terms because it is real history. So they rather frame it as something else. And now if the brothers had got on there and talked about them blocking the 1619 project on moral grounds or whatever it is that they wanted to block it on, I could have rocked with that. But did they do that? No. At some point, if people are going to have to start being honest. They're going to have to stop being honest. But one thing you do notice, they stopped talking about critical race theory for the most part after the 1619 project buzz kind of worn off. Even though the 1619 project was actually partially funded by, guess who? It wasn't Biden. You guessed it, it was under Trump. Has nothing to do with politics, or at least one Democrats versus Republican. It's only become a more of a central idea now because Biden wanted to put more money behind it and teach more cultural studies in the schools. If you're against cultural studies in the schools, then you should say so, instead of trying to say that they're trying to force CRT on us. And lastly, a lot of these guys talked about communists and socialists and stuff like that. There's nothing in the 1619 Project about teaching history, real history, that had anything to do with communists or socialists. Real history should be taught. Now, some of the other funny stuff that teachers apply when they're actually trying to teach a lesson, can't speak on that. But let's start being honest, okay? It's about how you want to socialize, how you want to brainwash kids. Everybody wants people to believe that George Washington chopped down a cherry tree and couldn't tell a lie, or Honest Abe couldn't tell a lie, which is all bullshit. And Thomas Jefferson was the writer of the Constitution. But Thomas Jefferson was also the one that wanted slaves to be bred internally so we can get more money for them. Anyhow, don't want this to go on too long because there's going to be more to come, man. Because, as I dug into this, now I'm pissed off. Before I was just annoyed. Now I'm pissed off because I hate when people just flat out lie. Why don't you just freaking tell the truth of what you're trying to do? You weren't trying to block critical race theory. You're trying to block the 1619 Project, but you couldn't because that would be too embarrassing. Anyway, let me jump off here. This is BGS out, and I'll see you guys on the next one. Peace.